My girlfriend and I used to enjoy going on camping trips pretty frequently during the weekends. We lived in the Appalachian region in Virginia, so we would often explore new places in or around the Appalachian Mountains. Both of us had stressful jobs during the weekdays, so spending time in nature and getting away from home on the weekends was very beneficial for us. One Saturday morning, we decided to hike a small 3-mile trail that led to an isolated camping ground on a flatter part of the mountain. Although we had been on dozens of camping trips in the Appalachian Mountains, we had never been to this specific spot before. However, based on the number of reviews on Google, we assumed that it would be a well-known trail and campground. We packed our bags and loaded the truck with our camping gear, and it only took us 45 minutes to drive there. As we got closer, it started to rain quite heavily, but this was typical in the mountains, and we didn't let it bother us. When we arrived at the trailhead, which was located just off the side of the road, we saw only one other car parked there. We were surprised that there weren't more people given the popularity of the trail, but we were also glad that it wasn't crowded. As we started to unpack our gear, my girlfriend noticed that the passenger door of the parked car was slightly open. We looked around to see if the owner was nearby, but there was no sign of him. I decided to close the door since we assumed that the owner had accidentally left it open. The whole passenger seat was soaked from the rain, but at least it wouldn't get any worse. I went back to our car to grab my stuff, and then we both started making our way down the trail. We talked about how weird it was that the door was open and how most people would probably notice that their car wouldn't even lock due to the open door. It's worth mentioning too that it was clearly a pretty expensive newer car, which just made it more strange. Anyways, the rain started picking up at this point, so we began walking faster so we could get to the campsite and set up our tent. I want to say it took us about 2 hours to get to the end, as it was mostly uphill. Once we were there, the first thing we noticed was a tent already set up in the middle of the flat area. It was pretty small, definitely a one-person tent. We figured that they were probably in there sheltering from the rain, so we went to a far corner on the site and set up our tent there. We sat inside for an hour, eating some food we brought and laying some of our stuff out to dry before hearing voices outside. The rain hitting the tent was too loud to hear what they were saying, so I unzipped the front and looked out. I jumped a little bit, as there were two men kneeling down and looking at us from just a couple of feet away. But then they smiled and introduced themselves. They said they were staying in the tent in the middle and that they'd been there for a few days. I quickly introduced my girlfriend and me and told them that we were just here for the night. Then they headed back and I zipped up our tent and looked at my girlfriend. The whole interaction seemed a little off, as they seemed to be acting a little strange. I observed that both of the men were wearing tightly fitted jeans and regular t-shirts, and their tent seemed too small for two full-grown men. It didn't seem like they were camping or hiking, especially for a few days, they had claimed. We decided to leave the tent zipper partially open to keep an eye on them. An hour passed and we didn't see anything unusual or anything at all. I assumed they were cramped up in their tent the whole time. It was getting pretty dark, so we decided to call it a night and prepared our sleeping bags. I zipped up the tent and laid down next to my girlfriend. I must have fallen asleep fast because I don't recall anything after that. However, a few hours into the night I woke up needing to use the bathroom. It was still raining, so I put on cheap plastic rain poncho to avoid getting soaked. I walked a few feet behind our tent and behind a tree, but through the rain I could hear voices. It was difficult to locate where they were coming from, so I turned my head in every direction. I started to get paranoid, but I couldn't see anyone. Then I noticed the front zipper on the small tent in the middle was open. It was hard to see in the darkness and rain, but I am almost certain that nobody was inside. The man had told me they were staying in the tent overnight, so this made me more anxious. I rushed back to our tent, woke up my girlfriend, and told her about the situation. She was tired, but I could tell she was just as concerned as I was. While we were discussing what to do, we heard voices behind our tent. I didn't know what to do, but I knew staying in the tent didn't seem safe anymore. I instructed my girlfriend to pack our bags quickly and be ready to leave if necessary. I grabbed a small pocket knife and quickly got out of the tent. As I looked over at the trees, I saw the two men standing there just a few feet away from us. I recall this moment distinctly because both men looked at me with no expression, and they didn't move at all. As soon as I saw the two men, I knew they were planning something terrible. They did not seem afraid of me at all. A moment later, my girlfriend looked out of the tent, which shook me out of my state of shock. I yelled at her to go and pointed at the trail back down the mountain. I followed her and left my bag in the tent behind. As we made it to the edge of the campsite, I looked back and saw the two men still standing there. They didn't even attempt to chase us. They just stood and watched as we ran away in total fear. We sprinted for about 10 minutes before slowing down and walking quickly for the remainder of the way. When we got back to the car, we noticed that the other parked car was still there, but the passenger door was open. I immediately drove us to the nearest gas station where we called the police. A few minutes later, they arrived and we recounted what had happened. After a few days, we received more information that made everything even more terrifying. When an officer went to investigate the area, they found that the car belonged to an older man who had been reported missing. All of the belongings from the car had been stolen, and they confirmed that the tent on the campground belonged to that old man as well. However, they did not find the two men or any concrete evidence other than their shoe prints. The old man was not found either, and to this day he has not turned up. My girlfriend and I both felt sick knowing that we could have just been seconds away from something horrific. We may never know for sure what these two men were planning, but the entire situation leads to a pretty good guess. What I do know is that the image of those two men standing in front of me still haunts my memories to this day. In my late 20s and early 30s, I had a job that provided me with the opportunity to travel extensively. However, I was usually limited to spending only a few days in one location for work. During those brief stays, I didn't have much time to explore the places I visited. However, during a work trip to Pennsylvania, I finished a day early, which meant that I had an extra day to spend there. I decided to make the most of this opportunity and do something fun. I opted for a long trail that went through beautiful forests and trees. Although I had always loved nature, my job had kept me inside buildings or airplanes most of the time. This was a perfect chance for me to enjoy the weather and scenery. To begin my adventure, I woke up early and headed to a store to purchase some hiking clothes since I didn't pack any with me. The trail was about an hour away from my hotel, and I reached there just before noon. There didn't seem to be anyone else around, which was perfect for me. I had read online that the trail would take around 6 hours there and back, so I was prepared for an all-day hike. I carried a backpack with a water bottle and some snacks and started walking down the path. The first hour of the hike was peaceful, just me alone on a path between the trees. It was a great way to take a break from my stressful work life. As I continued walking, I spotted a man sitting on the ground next to the path up ahead. He seemed to be sleeping, with his head hanging down and a hoodie covering his face. As I approached him, he looked up at me and stared me down. I found it a little creepy and was unsure of what to make of him. I continued to occasionally check behind me as I walked past him and down the trail. A couple of hours later, I sat down on a small log at the edge of the path to have a snack. After 3 or 4 minutes, the same man that I had walked past earlier appeared down the path, making his way towards me. Although he was still far away, I quickly packed my bag and continued down the trail to avoid interacting with him. However, my plan didn't work, as a few minutes later I heard loud running footsteps coming up behind me. I turned around and saw the man jogging in my direction. I moved over to the side hoping he would pass by, but he stopped right in front of me. I felt really uneasy about him, and he didn't say anything but reached into his pocket and held out a wallet, claiming that I dropped it. I knew the wallet wasn't mine, and it was completely empty. I told him that he must be mistaken, and that I didn't bring my wallet with me. However, he insisted that the wallet was mine and that I needed to take it back. I could see in his eyes that he was getting mad, and I was nervous. Although I suspected that he was trying to rob me or do something strange, I didn't know what to do other than listen to him. I just nodded, took the wallet from his hand. He looked into my eyes, smiled, and said, "You're welcome." Then he turned around and started walking away on the trail. I stood there for a minute thinking about the interaction. After that, I held out the wallet and examined it carefully. It was a typical brown folding wallet, worn and old. I searched every pocket, but there was nothing inside. I was puzzled and confused, but I didn't want to encounter that man again. So I started walking back to my car. It was already 4 p.m., and I had more than 2 hours before I'd reach my car. I tried to enjoy the walk, but the strange encounter kept bothering me, and I became increasingly anxious. I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me. Finally, I saw my car in the distance. The sun was setting and casting low shadows on everything. As I approached my car, I noticed a man's shadow coming from behind it, as if he was crouched down. I stopped and stared at the shadow next to my car. Although I was aware that running away could lead to negative consequences, I also knew that the man was likely planning to steal my car and rob me. After a brief moment, I quietly checked my pocket for my keys and proceeded toward the passenger door. Swiftly, I unlocked the car and entered through the passenger side. The man jumped up and made a run for the driver's side as I heard him approaching. However, I locked the door just before he attempted to open it. He started pounding on the window while I crawled into the driver's seat and switched on the car. I recognized him as the same person from earlier who then shouted at me to return his wallet. Ignoring him, I drove away from the scene as quickly as possible. As I pulled away, he ran back toward the trees. My strategy had worked as I managed to confuse him by not going through the driver's side, giving me enough time to get in and lock the door. I remember seeing a police station on the way and stopped there to report the incident and return the wallet. After that, I headed back to my hotel and called a friend to recount the events of the day. Although the purpose of the wallet remains unclear, I am relieved that I escaped the situation unscathed and without any losses. Now, I always carry a small pocket knife when I go for walks, as you never know what unexpected situations may arise. It was almost the end of October last year, which is known for its ideal hiking weather. It is neither too hot or too cold. I used to hike a lot with a group of friends, but their jobs with no fixed schedules made it difficult to plan hikes together. Consequently, I often went for shorter hikes alone to enjoy the serenity. Fortunately, I had the weekend off, so I found a great hiking and camping trail nearby and drove there on Saturday morning. I had been on this trail a few years ago and always wanted to return. The trail was a loop, which meant that it followed a big circle from the start and would take around a day and a half to complete. Upon reaching the small gravel parking lot, I parked my car and headed to the trailhead. The first few miles were flat, cutting through grassy fields before leading into a forest at the bottom of a small mountain. It was around midday when I was well into the forest and spotted a man walking up ahead. At first, I couldn't tell if he was walking toward me or away from me since he was quite far. However, as I continued forward, I realized he was walking towards me. This trail wasn't very popular, and the last time I hiked it, I didn't encounter anyone. Nonetheless, since it was the weekend, I assumed that maybe he had the same idea as me. As I approached him, I noticed that he didn't have a backpack on. This was unusual, considering that I had been hiking for about 6 or 7 hours, and there was no way someone would travel this far without even a water bottle. He waved at me once he was a few feet ahead, and I returned the gesture to be polite, but I remained cautious since I was in such an isolated area. As he passed me, I heard his footsteps stop and the dirt crumble as if he had turned around. I looked back and saw that he was facing me. He then asked me something really strange. "Where's your group at?" I wasn't sure how to respond, as all I could really think about was whether this stranger knew that I usually had a group or if he was just trying to figure out that I was alone. Either way, it was unsettling and made me really nervous. I responded by telling him that they were on their way, just a couple of minutes behind me. As I walked along the trail, I struggled to think of anything to say to the man beside me. I didn't want him to think I was alone, so I was relieved when he smiled and continued on his way. However, as I walked further down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the encounter. The fact that he didn't have a backpack, despite being so far into the hike, made me uneasy. To be safe, I decided to set up camp a little ways off the main trail. After finding a flat spot and pitching my tent, I tried to relax and forget about the strange man. I ate my pre-packed lunch and attempted to sleep, but I was restless. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the trees behind my tent. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the steps were unmistakably human. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I was left waiting in silence, afraid to move. Hours passed before the footsteps finally faded away. The next morning, I cautiously exited my tent and noticed clear footprints in the dirt behind a nearby tree. I panicked and quickly packed up my camp before sprinting back to the trail. I was terrified at the thought of being stalked by a stranger in the middle of an isolated forest hours away from any help. Once I reached the trail, I walked as quickly as possible back the way I came. At this point, it probably would have been faster to continue on, but I decided against it. I had a feeling that whoever was watching me was anticipating that move. Fortunately, nothing else occurred during my trek back to my vehicle, which I didn't arrive at until nearly sunset. I recounted the strange man's behavior and what I witnessed to my friends. They agreed that I was fortunate to have avoided any further danger, I informed the police about the suspicious activity on the trail, but they were unable to do much about it. Since then, I have become more vigilant when hiking and camping, and I seldom venture out alone. I will never know what the man's true intentions were, and I hope no one else has to find out either.